This Week in Radio Tech, episode 296, is brought to you by the Axia Fusion AOIP mixing console. Fusion, where design and technology become one. By the ZipStream R2 hardware audio processor and stream encoder. Stream like you mean it with ZipStream. And by Lavo and the Crystal Clear virtual radio console. Crystal Clear is the console with a multi-touch touchscreen interface. The FCC's AM revitalization proceeding continues to grind its way through the system, and there's a lot at stake right now for AM stations of all classes. Numerous broadcasters and consultants are filing comments, and so is Scott Fybush. Scott joins Chris Tobin and Kirk Harnack to discuss some strong opinions about improving the AM radio band. Hey, welcome into This Week in Radio Tech. I'm Kirk Harnack, your host. So glad that you're here. This is the show where we talk about radio technology. And you know, lately we've spent a lot of time talking about streaming audio and audio quality. And we're going to go back to the RF world today. In fact, we're going to talk about a part of the RF world that we don't often discuss, and that's the legal part, the rules part, the how do we keep things from interfering with each other part of the RF rules. And we're going to try to figure out how to slow down AM's decline, or if that's even a good idea, or just where all that stands. So we're going to be joined in a few minutes by Scott Fybush, who is our special guest today. I'm Kirk Harnack, and along with me is my usual co-host, and that's the best-dressed engineer in radio, Chris Tobin. Hey, Chris, welcome in.
Well, hello, Kirk. Yes, it's going to be a good topic. I'm looking forward. I was reading through Scott's comments to the commission, and they're actually right on spot, right on point, I should say. It's really good. It's going to be good.
You know, Scott and I were actually discussing earlier. I said, Scott, your paper is so well written. You convinced me of every single point here. I agree completely. But can you talk about other points? And Scott said, you know, I've read other points, and they're pretty compelling too. So it's a problem. AM has problems that are not easily solved. They don't have easy solutions, and no matter what happens, somebody's going to be a little bit ticked off. So let's go ahead and bring in the guy who's proposing some things that I'm sure will tick somebody off. Scott Fybush. Hey, he's been with us before. He's here again. Hey, Scott, welcome in.
How you doing?
Good. Glad you joined us. Are you in Rochester?
Beautiful Rochester, New York. It's a little gray and chilly out, but I've heard rumors that there's 70-degree weather not far away. So.
Wouldn't that be great? So spring, yeah, Colorado getting snow first day of spring. Scott, I think I told you before that when I was a little bitty kid, probably about 3 years old, I lived in Rochester.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, in fact, my little brother, who's now departed, but my brother was born in Rochester at the hospital there. I'm not sure which one, but that was what? That was 50 years ago. He was born in Rochester.
I did not know that.
How about that? So, okay, so here we are to talk about...
a month from now, we'll all be in Vegas. So.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. Chris will be there. You'll be there. I'll be there. We'll all be in Las Vegas. So we're going to be talking about AM revitalization. And, Scott, tell us... Well, we got a commercial coming up here, but tell us, Scott, specifically what is the rulemaking? What have you commented on, and others commented on? What specific thing is it that we're commenting on?
We are now in the further notice of proposed rulemaking. So 2 years ago now, there was a comment period for this whole laundry list of changes that the commission was considering making. And they came out, we all waited for about a year and a half for them to finally take some action. Last fall, they came out with a few pieces, including this AM translator window that's been so huge for the last few months. And then they said, okay, now we want comments on these things. And most of them were very technical, having to do with protections for different classes of AM stations, and in particular, this question of AM skywave protection. And then they were also looking for comments on issues involving main studios for AM stations and whether they can grant waivers for those, and on this issue involving the AM expanded band that the FCC just kind of set aside for close to 20 years and said, we're just going to pretend this never happened, and now they need to think about it again. So there was a whole list that they came out with, a comment period that just ended on Monday, and now reply comments that are going to run for about the next month or so.
All right. You wrote some terrific comments. You've placed them online. And I tell you what, the URL is a bit lengthy. I'm going to copy and paste that into our private chat, and maybe we can get Suncast, if he's able to get that link put up on the screen so that others could go watch as well. So Producer Suncast, there's the link. If you can, anyway, see if you can get that on the screen. If you can, great. If not, don't worry about it. We'll have it in the show notes.
There we go. It's also right on the front page of my site if you just go to fybush.com.
Oh, great idea. Fybush.com and click on the link. Great. Hey, our show is brought to you in part by the folks at Axia and the new Axia Fusion console. You've heard us talking about this for a while. It is still an absolutely amazing console. And I wonder if Chris Tobin might chime in a bit. Chris, you had experience with some Axia Element consoles. I don't believe you've had hands-on with a Fusion yet, have you?
With the Fusion, no. But I'm sure under the hood it's probably about the same or more improved with the newer protocols and things that are coming out with Livewire. But it was good stuff. The Element was great.
Well, I'll tell you what, since you are very familiar with the Element, and a lot of our viewers and listeners are familiar with the Axia Element, because there's literally thousands of them out there. So let me tell you, as if I was talking to anybody with an Element console, I'll tell you what a couple of the differences are between the Fusion and the Element. So if you've got an Element, you kind of know, you know all about that. The Fusion improves on the Element in several ways. First of all, it does away with any of the Lexan screening on the top. The top of the console is, I guess you might say it's a bit more of an industrial look, but it's also very beautiful at the same time. So the top of the console is double anodized, etched aluminum, and all the markings are laser etched. So what that means is that they can't rub off. You can't peel them off. You can't pull them off. All you can do is wipe them clean, and they'll look like the day that they were brand new. Now, I must say the Element, its Lexan overlays were incredibly well designed. The printing was actually on the back side of them, and they were inlaid in a routed out lowered section. So unlike a lot of other consoles where, well, the disc jockey could, just in his spare time, take his fingernail and run it up under the Lexan and start pulling it off, or take a ballpoint pen and run it around and mess it up. You couldn't do that with the Element because the Lexan the edges of it were actually protected down inside a routed out section that fit the Lexan perfectly. And the printing, like I said, was on the bottom side. So it would never wear off. Now, you could wear out the Lexan, if you were to rub it forever. It is plastic after all. The Fusion does away with that possibility because it's all double anodized aluminum and laser etched. And that means it's there permanently. And it looks permanently good. You can't make it look bad. It'll just look great. Almost all the buttons, I think all the buttons were changed from round buttons to square buttons. Why? Well, we got a lot of feedback on the Element, and one of the feedbacks that we got from some parts of the world were that we don't like the round buttons. We would prefer square buttons. Square buttons look more professional. So, the Fusion has all square buttons on it. The good news is the button actions themselves are the same ones that Axia designed and approved and tested with over 100,000 operations. Actually built a machine to push it like this. So every one of them, it's the same button action, but this time in a square button. Of course, all the lights on it are LEDs behind the buttons. So they don't burn out like light bulbs do. So they should last for, well, not forever, but, the life of the console. Then the next thing that we did, and Chris, you remember on the Element, you had this 10-digit LED alphanumeric display that would show show your source, and would also show off if you were maybe sending a back feed, that kind of thing.
Right.
Well, the Fusion console has an OLED display that has a lot more information. It has more room for the name of the source, but it also has full-time incoming confidence meters. So if there's audio coming in that source, even if you don't have it faded up, because these are pre-fader meters, it shows you that, hey, there's audio coming in here. Or guess what? There's no audio coming in. Don't bother fading that up. There's nobody there. It also shows you if it's a fader that has a back feed, like it's feeding headphones to another studio, or it's feeding a mix minus to a codec or a hybrid. It shows you the back feed level right there on the display. So you have lots of information available to you right there on the screen. And the final difference, actually there are a lot more, but one of the big differences is instead of a CAN bus cable between the Fusion console and its power supply unit, they've changed that to now it's an Ethernet cable. And now CAN bus is still used inside the Fusion console, because they're very short runs, and CAN bus is a really good technology to do that because it's great at distributing power. But now you can locate your Fusion console farther away from the power supply than you could before. Now it's an Ethernet equation, so it's, you could be 100 meters worth of cable away from the power supply. So just a few of the changes between the Element, which you may be very familiar with, and the Fusion console. You have fewer constraints about locating your power supply close to the console. Chris, does that sound like a good deal to you?
That's excellent. Yeah, I like the CAN bus change because that posed a problem for one of the installations I worked on. But other than that, it was perfect. And the surface, and the surface, the etching, and all the changes, that makes total sense. However, I'm saddened to hear that the rounded switches are gone, though. They were fun.
I thought they were kind of sexy, but not everybody in the world liked them. Some people are, set in their square ways, so we decided to accommodate them. All right, thanks a lot, Axia and Fusion, for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. Go to telosalliance.com and click on the Axia button, and there it is. You can look at the Fusion console. Really great line of consoles. Okay, Scott Fybush is our guest, and Chris, you and I are going to listen just a bit while Scott you've given us some background here, Scott, about this being the continued, what'd you call it? Comment period?
Further notice of proposed rulemaking.
There you go. Gosh, that's a lot of words. So
there are a lot of lawyers getting rich off of that, believe me.
Yeah, I imagine so. Can you give us a little bit more background first, and then I want to dive into your point topic by topic, because I think you do a great job of describing each topic in detail. So what's the bigger story here?
So there are a couple of pieces to this, and one of the pieces all of a sudden that's getting a lot of public attention is this question of whether or not Class A radio stations should be protected in their skywave contours. So Class A radio stations are what we used to think of as 1A and 1B clear channels. WSM, WBZ, WCBS, WFAN. There are about 24 of these still left. And they enjoy an unusual level of protection compared to the other 5,000 or so AM stations out there. So everybody else, if you're beyond a point where you can receive any ground wave from an AM station, whatever service it provides by skywave is not protected by interference. So you may be able to sit there in Nashville, and you might be able to get a skywave signal from, say, a Class B station that's coming out of Cincinnati at night. But that's not protected service, and if I can put something else on that frequency in Nashville, I can go ahead and do it without worrying about interfering with the skywave of the Cincinnati signal. Having said that, there are still a lot of complex rules about where my skywave from my new signal can go. And it gets, there are about 6 guys in the entire industry who understand every bit and piece of this. And I don't claim to understand it in the way that somebody like Ron Rackley or a Ben Dawson would. But what the FCC is looking at that's gotten a lot of public attention now is this idea of saying, okay, we're not going to protect the skywave anymore at all. Instead, we'll set up new protection rules for these Class 1A AMs that in effect will limit the amount of protected coverage they get at night from about 750, 800 miles that they get now, down to about 375, 400, depending on exactly how the rule is written. Which means, for instance, that I may be able to get WSM from Nashville fairly clearly up here in Rochester at night, and that's a distance, I think, of about 800, 700 miles, something like that. I could now, if I wanted to put a station on 650 and could squeeze it in otherwise up here, I could theoretically now put a 650 up here under these new rules without protecting WSM skywave. And needless to say, that has rattled the chains of the owners who still own these Class A stations. And so a number of them, including primarily iHeart, but a couple others also, have started soliciting public comment about this on the air and on their websites in an effort to create a record for the commission to say, wait a minute, people still use this service, and it still matters. And so all of a sudden, this has been getting attention outside of the usual small circle of us who pay attention to these things. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that affects the FCC and how much attention they pay to some of these comments that aren't technical at all, but just say things like, hey, I listen to WSM in upstate New York. Please don't make that go away.
Yeah, and WSM is probably a good and interesting example, because it's one of the stations that plays a very niche format, especially on Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday nights when they have the Grand Ole Opry. And there are still plenty of people in the hollers of West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, and Virginia, and Tennessee, and I'm sure lots of other places who listen to that, and a lot of those folks may not have easy access to the internet. Chris Tobin, though, you live in a place where there are a number of these big Class A AM stations. What's your sense of their feeling about these proposals?
From what I've heard from some folks, they're looking for the protection. They're looking to keep things intact. It's a tough one, as Scott pointed out, and I know from reading many articles and talking to a lot of folks. You got the public opinion of whether AM radio is still a viable service, as mentioned earlier. You got the issue of the technical stuff. Technology has advanced so much and changes have been made. Many of the AM broadcasters are still, operating with antenna systems that were designed for optimum skywave from the 30s and 40s. So, you got a lot of things working against you. And then you have just the mindset of how people use or digest or ingest, if you will, sometimes for that term, their information, and whether AM still is something that is of importance. The fact that you can get, I listen at night, I travel around, I have my super radio, my GE super radio I use, and even some other small portables when I drive in the car. I listen to a lot of the nighttime signals that come in from outside the area. And a lot of times it's good information. It's something different. It's fun. It's entertaining. It's part of the experience. But a lot of people don't feel that way anymore.
So, Scott, in fact, you mentioned, as Chris just did, about back when a lot of these stations were built, their antenna systems were designed for maximum skywave to get that signal out there, especially at night. And we do have to ask the larger question. Okay, here we are in 2016. Internet is available in lots of places. There are lots of other ways to get information as opposed to 1938 when at night the only way to get information was by AM radio, or about the only way. Where do we as a society go with this, and what takes precedence over time?
There are so many moving pieces to this, and there are a lot of people weighing in who all have good points to make. And because there are local stations who are making the very good point that it's more valuable to my local community to be able to continue running full power during critical hours and into the evening than it is for them to have access to a signal that may very well be repeating the same satellite talk show that's on 19 other stations that they can also hear. So there's a good point there where I finally come down on this. I had to think about it for a while before figuring out how I wanted to present my comments. But what I finally came down to is, look, you still have a problem with the basic laws of physics because you've had allocation changes that have happened going back to World War II and even earlier, where there's been politically motivated desire, a business motivated desire to get more stuff onto the AM dial, which is understandable. The trouble is that you have laws of physics to deal with, and even a lot of the regulators at the FCC don't seem to grasp the concept, at least up at the highest levels of the FCC, where they're not engineers or have any engineering background. You can't stop skywave. These medium wave frequencies want to travel by skywave. You can't change the laws of physics to make them stop traveling by skywave. You have, as Chris mentioned, and as I mentioned in my comments, you have this installed base of transmitting antennas that goes back in a lot of cases to the 30s and 40s that were designed at the time to maximize skywave. But even if you wanted to make it go away, it won't. And so the question becomes, do you try to cram in a lot of signals that are going to be substandard from day one, that are going to receive huge amounts of incoming interference that are going to make them nearly useless, that might create a tiny little service area at the expense of creating a big new interference area?
Yeah.
Or do you want to say, you know what, maybe we've done enough at this point, maybe these signals should be left alone, however long AM has left, they should be left alone to do what AM still does best. And you're absolutely right. There are people who, either by choice or by necessity, do not have access to anything else. Certainly there are technologies wherever you are in the country. I mentioned this in the filing too. You can get access to satellite TV. You can get at least some form of internet by satellite or some sort of wireless internet provider. You can use a cell phone for a wireless connection in most, if not all, of the country now. You can get satellite radio. But any of those you have to pay for. You have to depend to some extent on an external provider to continue providing them to you. And you know what? If the worst happens, and if we all get bombed back to the Stone Age, as it were, what's going to still function most likely? You're going to have a better chance of getting something on an AM radio than on just about everything else. So I think that's still worth preserving on balance, and I think that there are other solutions like translators that are probably more valuable at this point for local stations that want to serve a community. And I should say here I'm very biased on the translator issue because I'm into the brokerage business now, buying and selling them, so I want to disclose that right up front too and say that I do have a vested interest there now.
You know, hindsight's 2020, but wouldn't it have been great if back when we had the 80-90 docket and a whole lot of new Class A, that is lower power FM stations coming out, but high enough power to serve a typical town or county, would it have been great if AM broadcasters absolutely had absolute first dibs on those. And but to get that, at a sunset period, they had to give up their AM signal. And if you had a great AM signal, maybe you wouldn't go for one of these 80-90 stations. But part of the problem is there are too many AM stations, and they don't all fit well. And the rules governing their hours of operation and patterns and all that are awfully complex. Wouldn't it be great if we could get rid of a lot of them, let the people who want to stay on AM stay there because they have big powerhouse signals, or it's the only signal in town, whatever it may be. I just wish there was some way to, by attrition, get people off of that. And, well, I'll let you talk about that, Scott and Chris. And then, Scott, we probably ought to talk about attrition as it relates to the expanded AM band.
There have been, I think the best answer to your question is there have been a lot of barn doors that have closed 5 or 10 or even 20 years too late. And gradually, I think the regulations are starting to make more sense, but probably too late to do a lot of good. And one great example of that is the change that the FCC made kind of quietly a few years ago in what it calls its rural radio policy. It used to be up until just a few years ago that if you had a station that had gotten, let's say, a Class C or a C1 or a C2 40 or 50 miles from a major community, that you could move it into another small town near that big community. And all of a sudden, your station that might once have been a Murfreesboro station is now a Nashville station, let's say. Mm-hmm. And the FCC finally realized a little too late that, wait a minute, we've been too quick to take a lot of the service out of communities that might have actually needed it back where they were. Now, all of a sudden, it's harder to do, but only after most of the moves that could have been made got made. And so I think they're trying at this point to find some backdoor ways to fill some of that space in. One suggestion I made in my original round of comments 2 years ago that hasn't gotten any action yet is that at some point, if an AM station is depending primarily on its translator to reach its audience, and there are some that do and there are some that don't, but if it's transitioned primarily to being an FM station that just has an AM tacked along, operating daytime hours just to keep the license alive, why not allow that to be shut down? In particular, why not allow some sort of free market to develop, where if I've got a station somewhere else that I want to grow, maybe I can compensate the guy who's got the AM he doesn't need anymore to take it silent and keep it silent. Mm-hmm. And that's something, even though the FCC has been going for this kind of free market approach in a lot of other areas, it's something they haven't really considered yet with AM. It's going to be interesting to see if they get there, and it's going to be interesting in particular to see if they get there before the commission potentially turns over next year.
So is it the case that right now you can't pay somebody else to turn their license in? You would have to buy the station and then turn it in yourself?
You can pay somebody to turn it in under certain circumstances. The problem is that if that other broadcaster wants to stay alive on its translator, it needs to have that AM legally attached to it still.
Yeah.
So you can't do like what happened to WoWo, where Intercity Broadcasting paid to downgrade it from Class A status and to bring it down to Class B in order to boost their New York signal at night. I thought about suggesting some kind of mechanism for that in my comments to the commission, but I don't know at this point if they would have gone for it, and it lends itself to a certain degree of potential abuse there. So I decided maybe better to leave that alone. But I think for smaller stations, at some point these translators essentially become their primary service. And there are also owners who are investing heavily. It's easy to spend at this point $70,000 or $80,000 to buy a translator, another 20 or 30 to move it into a community. And then if you get hit with an interference complaint, or if somebody can find a way to turn that frequency full power, you can still lose that FM channel because it's a secondary channel. So at some point, I think the commission's going to need to look and say, okay, maybe we've got to find some way to make at least some of these translators primary. And the trouble is with any regulation is that there is such a huge variety of situations around the country, and of spacings and of ground conductivities and of market conditions. It's very, very hard to write a one-size-fits-all rule.
Well, Chris, Tobin, you're my impression is you're kind of a free market solution kind of guy. Have you thought about any ways to get the number of AM stations reduced and reduce that part of the interference by that method, including what if we could somehow have the FCC pay AM stations to go off the air?
Well, paying them to go off the air would probably create unintended consequences. I'm sure of it. I was always thinking about the idea of maybe stop issuing licenses, renewal, adding more frequent, more applicants, and just letting things sort of slow down a bit. Or, as Scott pointed out, WOWO is a perfect example of changes being made. I remember, I don't know if I have it correct, but there was a station, I think it was on Long Island, New York. The Mighty 1290, I think, is how they used to go by back in the 70s. And they were purchased by their first adjacent station at the time. And I believe they went dark 1290 to allow the first adjacent 1260? Second? No.
1280.
Right. I'm trying to remember the callers. And there was a method to sort of open things up to make it more suitable for the station to serve the community. It's probably a case by case, but maybe that's something to consider. Marketplace where you have stations that just makes no sense. They're floundering, or they can't make it. Let them go dark. Let them sell it off, or do something, reap something, and then just leave the frequency off. That's it, and allow the stations around it to get back to something that makes sense. It's a tough one. There are a lot of moving parts. I wish I had a better way to approach it. I just don't know. Every something, and there's at least 6 different other people proposing the opposite, or find some other reason why it makes no sense. And it just sometimes you have to sort of just have the willingness to be able to say, technically, this is all we can do. A skywave, you can't get around it. The laws of physics can't be broken, and if you do, it's going to hurt. It's just the way it is. So maybe the next thing to look at is the community level. Scott, leave the Class A's as is, as Scott pointed out. We've come this far. It is a service that works. I've been through 2 blackouts and major storms here in the New York City area where, I'll tell you right now, you could have your cell phone for your internet service if you want. You can have your ISPs at home, and most of that stuff was useless. The only thing that did work was the portable AM/FM radio people carried with them. And if you were fortunate, you had a radio that received TV or a digital TV at the time. You'd be great. Now with digital TV and there's no portables out there, it's useless. But these are the things that people overlook, and we just make the assumption. Like right now, there's a big push for spectrum. We're selling spectrum so we can improve our broadband because it's a human right to have it. Meanwhile, let's look at the bigger picture. Who's getting it? Only a few people. What happens when there's a crisis or when there's something that really is necessary? You're without it. But yet you got the AM stations and FMs that are a resource that are just not being tapped properly, and just that AM issue, I just don't know. I wish I could come up with a way that makes sense. But it may be more of a case by case. Stations that go dark, just leave them dark. Don't have this innate desire to just say, "Oh, let's fill it. We got to keep things going. Got to make it more modern. This is the way we are." It just doesn't make sense. Or maybe get back to being more technical and understanding the reasons why certain things just can't be.
Scott, thoughts on that before we go to a break?
There are some interesting pieces, and here's where I get into this. I read some other comments, and these make sense too. And I mentioned before, in particular, Dawson and Rackley. And you read the comments that they put in, and it's fascinating because they studied very carefully what some of the situations are that exist already with some of the compromises that have already been made on the spectrum. And what they found is that even though there's this theoretical protection to 0.5 millivolts for skywave at night for the Class A's, that in reality that's been chipped away enough even before you get into this issue of ambient noise. It's been chipped away enough by other existing compromises the commission's made that most of the Class A's already aren't protected to that level. So they make a case, okay, you should set a somewhat higher, more realistic level of protection and allow some of the interference that's already sort of been jimmied into the system to be made official and make use of some spectrum that would otherwise not be used at that point, by allowing a few more stations on that could squeeze in with those new higher protection levels. You get to that issue of AM noise overall, which has crippled a lot of the AM dial. And the SPE had a really eloquent filing that they put in saying, wait a minute, before you start addressing everything at the transmission end, hey, FCC, do your job and enforce the Part 15 rules and the Part 18 rules also for medical devices that govern what kind of radiation sources you can have in your home, and start cracking down on that so that we can get a handle on the ambient noise level that's causing AM to become unusable, even at high signal levels locally in a lot of places. So there's a good argument to be made there as well. There are some, if you just sit down and start reading through these filings, a lot of people have a lot of good things to say, and there's no way everybody's going to walk away from this happy.
I know that with our little stations in Mississippi, we've got a couple of AMs, and I'm not sure which call letter it is. I haven't been totally involved with it. My business partner has, but basically because of one or two other AM stations in Mississippi that were already financially distressed before and finally have gone off the air, and a couple of them have not, have had their turned their license in. It ended up making room for one of our AMs to go up in power, non-directional daytime, and cover a larger area. So we've applied for that in light of those other stations going dark. I guess in some areas, in places where stations are already fairly distressed, the problem may take care of itself over time as stations go off the air. I do wish the commission would follow its own rules and be a little more aggressive about deleting licenses that in fact haven't been on the air for a year. And I do know there's been cases where of people that have been off the air for 5 years and their license still not deleted, and it's been reported. But that's, anyway.
Agreed.
The problem may take care of itself a bit. Hey, you're watching This Week in Radio Tech, episode 296. It's Kirk Harnack along with Chris Tobin, and our guest is Scott Fybush. And the subject is, Scott, would you repeat that subject again exactly?
This would be a further notice of proposed rulemaking in the FCC AM revitalization. And those air quotes are important because that's their title for it. And a lot of people are arguing, wait a minute, a lot of the stuff with translators doesn't even revitalize AM. It moves them to FM. My sense at this point, and I'm going to guess you agree with me as a broadcast owner, is that you're probably more interested in just making sure you can serve your community on some sort of platform and relatively agnostic as to what that platform ends up being. Am I right?
Yeah, that's basically true. I mean, sure, we'd love to have a full power FM to just replace our AM, but that's not going to happen right now. Hey, our show is brought to you in part by the folks at Telos and ZipStream. I want to tell you about the ZipStream R2. This is a hardware streaming appliance, and oh my goodness, is there a lot of power under the hood. By the way, there are some fans in this thing. You don't want to put it in your studio. This definitely goes in the rack room near the servers. Why? It's a combination of an audio device and an IT device. So what does it do? Well, the ZipStream R2 is a box that can bring in up to 8 stereo audio programs. Can bring them in by AES digital audio inputs or by Livewire or AES 67 audio inputs. Either way. So you bring those audio programs in, and then you can run audio processors inside it and generate audio streams for the internet. Now, how many can you do? Well, that's a little bit of a complicated question. One of the options available for the R2 is the Omnia 9 style of audio processing. So if you want to run Omnia 9 processing, you can run up to 8 of those inside this box. If you want to run the Omnia 3 3-band style processing, well, you can run a couple of, several dozen actually, of those inside the box. We figure you can probably get about 64 individually processed and encoded streams out of it. What kind of streams? Well, you can if you're the kind of broadcaster, you've been on the internet for a while, and you've make your streams available on several different platforms. You can encode and format streams for IceCast, for Shoutcast, RTMP streams for Wowza, for Adobe Flash, and also adaptive multi-rate streaming. That's included in the ZipStream R2. So if you need to get onto, say, Apple HLS or Microsoft Smooth Streaming, or coming down the road when it's all settled, MPEG Dash will be available. So you'll be able to right now, Apple HLS and Microsoft Smooth Streaming are on there. I've done demo streams of Apple HLS, and it's pretty cool. So the ZipStream R2 will let you do all of these simultaneously with 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 8 program streams coming in, program sources, and just about as many streams as you need going out to serve to stream servers at your CDN, whether it's, again, Shoutcast, IceCast, Wowza, Adobe Flash, or a service like Apple HLS. Do you go with that kind of service? Really amazing, the stuff that it can do. Plenty of power to deal with metadata. So no matter what your metadata source is, automation systems, or maybe an intermediary metadata aggregator program like CSRDS, one of those kind of programs that can bring in metadata from several sources and format it for each individual stream. That's all handled in the R2. And if you happen to be a Triton customer, if you deal with Triton, the Stream the World kind of software, well, all of their protocols, everything they ask for is built into the R2. So you can fully be compliant with Triton's requirements with the ZipStream R2. So this box is amazing. It's probably not for your one-off broadcaster. You want to buy it with, I think the minimum configuration is two inputs are turned on by licensing, and you can turn on up to 8 if you want to. And again, you can get that Omnia 9 processing on 1, 2, 3, or all the channels if you want to as well. Check it out on the web. It's at telosalliance.com. It's the ZipStream R2. And if it's not shipping now, it'll be shipping any day now. I've been in some of the meetings, and this thing has been in beta for almost a year at some sites, and I think it's ready to go. I love this thing. I did a video about it, and you want to check it out on the Telos Alliance YouTube channel. Thanks a lot to the ZipStream for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. All right, Scott, just to riff a bit more on what I was saying earlier about stations going off the air because they just can't afford to stay on anymore. It just doesn't make economic sense. The land is worth more to build a condominium complex, or the owner just says, I'm tired of this. We're going to focus on our FM and just turn that AM thing off. Well, that can open up expansion room for other stations, can't it?
It can. And even there are haves and there are have-nots, because you've got stations in some cases that aren't necessarily going to go silent, but they're never going to have the resources to do anything to improve either. And that's been one thing that's been raised by a couple of these commenters, is that, gee, it's great you're giving us this opportunity to expand FCC, but you know what? I can't justify spending $100,000 or $200,000 or even more to rebuild my AM system or put up another tower or get a more expensive transmitter, because I don't have the return on investment to do it, which means that you have a lot of stations that may just be sitting there. And as I say, there's this issue too with AMs that get translators, find most of their audience has gone off to the translator, and would be delighted to just turn off the AM and walk away from it if only they could. And right now, legally, you can't. And so that's something I think that the Commission is going to have to deal with as it works through some of the next phases. One of the interesting things about a rulemaking proceeding like this is that they start with the initial rulemaking proposal, and then they get into these further notices and these additional notices of inquiry. And some of these proceedings can stretch on for years and years as more ideas come up, but so much is going to depend now on what happens in November and who's in control of Washington and who's in control of naming commissioners to the FCC. A lot of this has been spurred by one particular commissioner. Ajit Pai has been behind a lot of this. And if he's off the commission and there's nobody with that kind of interest in AM radio, the whole thing could fizzle before something more happens. Or, who knows, he could become the chairman next time around, and all of a sudden this becomes an even bigger priority. So there are so many what-ifs in this right now. And especially as they look ahead to issues like this question of the AM expanded band and what to do with it, and some of these other little technical questions about translator protections, translator spacing. There's a great proposal out there now to allow translators to get a little more power by not having to deal with FM-IF spacing. Because right now a translator has to protect IF channels. First the 53rd and 54th adjacent FM channels, the same way that a 6 kilowatt Class A would. And so there are places where a translator could run 250 watts except for that. So there's a proposal out there. All these different moving parts, all of which can have all sorts of different intended and unintended effects. It's gonna be fascinating to watch it all work its way through. I wouldn't even dare to try to predict at this point what the end game for a lot of this is.
Real quick, I'll just give a little bit of our story, then we ought to move on to this expanded band stuff. And that is that, hey, in Greenville, Mississippi, we have an AM there, 1330. It's a full-time, although it was directional at night, and we couldn't afford to maintain 3 towers, and a lot of work was needed on the phaser. So we applied for a much lower power and 1 tower, non-directional at night. We have felled the 2 extra towers, and so we're on 1 tower day and night. Of course, daytime power in the day and very low nighttime power at night. But we got a translator, and it's located on the 1 AM tower. It's 250 watts. I honestly don't have a good feeling for how many of our listeners are listening to the translator versus the AM, but we certainly promote the translator every time that we promote the AM. We promote them both. And I know there will come a time, hey, we're on a piece of property that, look, it's in a small town that's not growing, but someday, I mean, it's right in a residential area. Someday that property should be worth more than the stations that sit on it. And I'd love to be able to move that translator somewhere else and not have the AM anymore when that economically that makes sense. I'd love to have that option.
Absolutely.
And that would get rid of a 1330, energy on the dial. I'm sure that there are plenty of other stations in the same boat, that they have a translator and they just wouldn't mind too much cutting the AM off.
Absolutely. I've talked to some of them, and there are others that very much want to keep their AM. That still believe, hey, this is an important way for us to reach the market, and maybe there's a little corner that we weren't serving at night that the translator helps out with. But they want to keep their AM and in some cases increase it. It's tough because there are people who've gotten into the business in relatively recent years who have found in some cases small town AM stations, revitalized them, done a good job with it, and don't understand because maybe they didn't grow up with skywave, maybe they're not DXers, maybe they believe that there's some magical way to get rid of skywave. They think, you know what, if I could just run my 5 kilowatts a day power at night, I'd be happy. And yeah, they would, and yeah, it would be a great thing for their community. And the trouble is that big picture of then, okay, if you're running 5 kilowatts of skywave, it still goes somewhere. And people forget about that sometimes. It still lands somewhere where you probably don't want it to go. But those are the laws of physics, and you can never regulate away the laws of physics, unfortunately. And of course, anybody who's ever done AMDXing knows that, it comes and it goes, and there are nights when distant signals are strong and nights when they're not. And it's very hard, not impossible, but very hard to predict. So it's again, there are just no easy answers to this thing. And then, as you mentioned, we get into the expanded band.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. And Chris, you might have some stuff to add there. I don't know if any expanded band stations in your part of the world, Chris. There's not many around here. I can only think of a couple that I know of.
Yeah, we have a couple.
Oh, do you? Okay. Scott, kind of give us, first of all, the big picture on expanded band. I remember this from, 20, 25 years ago when some started coming out, and I thought that the AM stations in the regular band were supposed to go away after some period of time, and I don't think they have.
This was a good example of unintended consequences of regulation. So what happened, this goes back, I believe, to a proceeding as far back as 1987, where the FCC said, okay, there's nothing else of any importance using 1610 to 1700. Should we be able to throw more stations up on there and expand the AM dial? Sure, why not? Good idea. They had what seemed at the time like a pretty good idea also of reducing overall AM interference across the band by figuring out which AM stations on the existing band were the sources of the most interference that could be made to go away. Gave them expanded band slots that they could decide to use or not use. Said everybody has to fit a particular model, 10 kilowatts day, 1 kilowatt night, non-directional. And they were supposed to have 5 years to run the X-band, get that going, and then sign the standard band off. And there was, as best I can tell, something of a change in policy inside the Media Bureau. These stations all came on starting in, I believe, 96, if I remember right. And, it was incredible for a while. There was one point where there was only one station on, and it was in California. I was living in an apartment outside of Boston at the time. And because that was the only thing on the dial at night, even with a kilowatt, on 1630, it made it all the way from Vallejo, California to Waltham, Massachusetts, because the band was so open. Eventually, things filled up, but not very much. And a bunch of stations said, you know what, we're very happy here on 930. Thanks for your offer of letting us go to 1700, but it really doesn't do a lot. Those never built. And then at some point, roughly around the turn of the millennium, the FCC said, you know what, we're just going to put all of this on hold and kind of pretend it never happened. So all the other changes that they've made with AM, for the most part, haven't affected X-banders. You couldn't apply for a new X-band station when they've opened up Windows. The X-band stations have been shut out of applying for translators when those have come up. And they've just kind of been left to sit there. And in the meantime, some of these stations never went off the air because they filed various appeals to the FCC that got put on a pile somewhere. And as long as the appeal was pending, the FCC couldn't force them to shut off. And so here we are 20 years later, and some of these are still operating. The FCC is finally saying, okay, what do we do about this now?
Oh,
and
Chris, I'm sorry, go ahead. I
was going to say there are two schools of thought on this, because there's one school of thought on this that says, you know what, rules are rules. They had their 5 years. They used their 5 years. Let's take them off. There's another argument, and there are filings that were made by most of the owners of these remaining X-banders, talking about 24 of them total, that say in a nutshell, you know what, pioneers of a new band have always made sacrifices to get that new band started, and in the end have generally gotten rewarded for it. For their patience. FM stations that went on in the 1940s that might have been worth nothing in the mid-1950s, the licensees who stuck with those found themselves sitting on incredibly valuable property in the 70s or 80s, and there was no recompense to anybody who had said in 1949, FM's not going to be worth anything, let's just shut it off. So their argument is that this parallels that. Their other argument is that the FCC is going to change the interference standards on the main part of the AM dial, as they're talking about doing, that getting rid of these existing AMs in a lot of cases wouldn't eliminate any interference that would be considered under these new standards. And then there are some that point out, hey, we're serving ethnic communities that wouldn't get served otherwise. My argument personally on balance was I think they may as well be allowed to stay. They've been there long enough, sort of adverse possession, if you will. If you park your car in your neighbor's driveway for long enough and he doesn't say anything about it, all of a sudden you've established a right to that, perhaps. We'll see what the FCC says. I don't think they're really eager to address this, but at the same time, I think they realize they can't just let it sit forever.
Yeah. Chris, any thoughts on expanded band?
No, I'm in agreement with Scott. I mean, they've been there long enough, that part, they probably should just stay with it. It's a tough one. I mean, it's just, I think, like Scott pointed out, with changes taking place at the FCC over the years, the upcoming elections, it's going to be hard to say. It's going to be hard for anyone to try and implement or make changes between now and then, because it requires some, energy or inertia, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think we're going to be seeing things just sitting idle for the moment.
It almost seems like a case of like I tell my 5-year-old boy Michael, clean up your room. You can have a piece of candy tonight before you go to bed. And he doesn't clean up his room, and we're all tired, and finally it's, screw it, everybody in the family gets a piece of candy. So that's kind of what it feels like. Hey, our show is brought to you in part by the folks at Lavo and the Crystal Clear console. We're going to play a little video here, just a couple minutes of it, with Mike Dosh explaining the Lavo console. I want to give you a taste of this video so you can go on their website and watch the whole thing for yourself if it looks interesting to you. Go ahead if you can run that, Suncast.
This is Crystal Clear. This is a PC program that acts as a control surface to replace a physical control surface in a radio environment. It's a full-function radio console, essentially on a big screen tablet-type computer. This is an all-in-one PC. It's generic. It's this particular one is Lenovo. You can use an HP. It doesn't really matter. The software is expecting some kind of a touch-screen computer, and this particular one will do 5 simultaneous touches. So you could actually move multiple faders at the same time with a touch screen like this. We looked at the emergence of touchscreen computers as an opportunity to maybe change the way we build interfaces in the radio console. So Crystal Clear is maybe the first of several different ideas that we've got for how to approach radio in a new way. And a lot of customers are very excited about this. So let's take a look at some of the features here. It looks familiar. We've got fader channels and faders. In this particular case, we've got sources that we've configured, microphones, we've got network audio inputs, we've got telephones, and we've got codecs, and all of these are available to the user all at the same time to make a radio show. We have a monitor section, so this is going to control our loudspeakers. We have headphones. We can talk to our studio guests, for example. Maybe we have people in the other room in front of microphones. They've got headphones on. I can talk to them. Essentially, it's a full-function radio control surface that is controlling our Crystal engine and making all of the mixes in the DSP. Let's take a look at some of the deeper features.
That's Mike Dosh. He's the Director of Virtual Radio Projects for the folks at Lavo, L-A-W-O. If this technology is interesting to you, that is running a radio console from a multi-touch touchscreen, then you need to check out the Crystal Clear from Lavo. Just go to lavo.com, L-A-W-O.com, and look for radio products and look for the Crystal Clear console. You can watch that whole video there in about 6.5 minutes. Mike Dosh takes you through that whole console and almost all of its features. It's really an amazing thing. Check it out at lavo.com, and we thank them very much for sponsoring This Week in Radio Tech. We've just got a couple of minutes left. Scott Fybush is our guest, and Chris Tobin is with us here as well, chiming in on this issue of AM. Scott, what is it? Oh, gosh. It's this big, long word.
Notice of further proposed rulemaking on AM revitalization.
Is that written down somewhere? I need to copy that, and I don't know if I can make that the title. I don't think it'll fit. Yeah,
it's, FCC lawyers doing their thing.
Yeah. Well, it's got it. I guess it has to be, precise. So, other than expanded band, the what was the one extra thing? You were talked about relaxing the main studio requirements. Can you tell me what that means?
So the idea is right now, if you're a non-commercial FM station, that you can pretty much automatically get a waiver that says you can put your main studio anywhere in the country and feed programming by satellite to a transmitter somewhere else, which means you don't have to maintain the main studio with the staffing requirements and the public file and all of that. And a bunch of AM broadcasters are saying, okay, you want to give us some regulatory relief that's really going to help us? If I own stations, let's say in 6 different cities in New England, to use a real-world example, why make me maintain a separate studio in New Hampshire and a separate one in one place in Connecticut and another place in Connecticut? Let me just put them all at my headquarters. We have toll-free numbers. We have websites. We have all of these wonderful abilities to reach out to listeners who are never going to come down physically to an office somewhere anyway. Give us that same relief that the non-commercial FM guys get. And I think it makes perfect sense. The one suggestion that I made is that the commission might also want to look at just how much leeway they're giving to some of these huge FM networks in allowing them to have those main studio waivers and maybe try to crack down on that a little bit. It's going to be very interesting to see where all of this goes in Vegas, too. Of course, we're just a few weeks away from NAB, and there will be commissioners and there will be bureau chiefs out there. And it's usually a really good way to get a sense of what they're actually making of what all of this actually means and where they really intend to go with it.
Wow. Do you know of any particular keynotes or broadcast engineering conference papers on this subject of AM revitalization?
I have not seen them yet. It's interesting because the regulatory stuff usually ends up over in the management track instead of the engineering track. So you kind of have to look carefully in a bunch of different places in the schedule to find all that. I'm still working out my schedule, so we'll see how all of this comes together. But very much looking forward, at least to seeing everybody. And a couple of my guys are throwing a big on Sunday night at the Aria. We just locked down that location today, so you'll be hearing a little more about that. And good chance to get out of this chilly weather and talk radio in a more favorable climate, at least.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to be doing 2 different TWiRT shows from Las Vegas, one of them on the Thursday before the show starts from the Public Radio Engineering Conference. I haven't really thought about the content for that show yet, but hey, Scott, maybe you and me can sit down with a cup of coffee, tea, or a favorite adult beverage and talk about the upcoming NAB. If you're out there that soon. Maybe you're not out there that soon. This is on the Thursday
I won't be
before.
out there. I'll be out west.
I'll be there.
I'll be out in L.A. at that point, but I'll certainly catch up with you once the show starts.
Chris, you'll be there on the Thursday before?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, well, maybe you and I can do a relaxed kind of show from there. Maybe from
absolutely.
The hotel where the PREC, the Public Radio Engineering Conference, that hotel has a beautiful courtyard that is just ideal for sitting back and doing a little show from right there.
I'm set.
Good.
Let's see. Bring some rum, Coke. We'll be fine.
I'll take care of the bar tab as long as it's 1 drink apiece.
Fair enough. I'll do the second round of drinks.
Scott Fybush. So Fybush.com is your website. You'll find all things Fybush, including links to Northeast Radio Watch. And, Scott, I guess you'll find a link to this filing, your AM improvement filing that you made.
It is right there on the front page, and there are even some tower site calendars still available at this point on clearance.
I've got mine right over here. I'm looking at them at March. I got to flip it over here in a few days, but yeah, it's right here.
Little early for the 2017, but it is in production. Be a 2017, so that the tradition continues for another year yet.
Good deal. Chris Tobin, thank you for being with us from wherever you are in the New York City area.
I'm at an engineering firm, an RF engineering facility, DSI RF engineering. So yeah.
Good deal. All right, thanks to both of you for joining us. Thanks to our sponsors as well, Axia Fusion console, the Telos ZipStream R2, and the Lavo Crystal Clear audio console. Thanks so much to Suncast for producing our show today and working through the usual myriad of technical problems with aplomb and getting them pretty well solved, and we appreciate that very much. Thanks to Andrew Zarian and the GFQ Network for taking care of our show. And tell your friends about it, would you? We're going to see you next week on This Week in Radio Tech. Bye-bye, everybody.